Hello and welcome back, and everybody, Levi here, and in today's video I've got a mono red build with some really interesting and niche interactions that I've not really seen in game, so I thought I'd flesh this deck out and make a video about it because it seems really interesting, something that's really up my alley. As a red mage myself, I feel like I don't make enough videos about red decks. So the commander I'm talking about today is Purphoros, bronze blooded, 4 and a red for a 7/6 god with indestructible. As long as your devotion to red is less than 5, Purphoros isn't a creature. Since other creatures you control have haste, which is decent, but the really important ability is pay 2 and a red. You may put a red creature card or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, and you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So the theme of the deck is going to be just generic ETB value / dice triggers, but there's a lot of really cool interactions. I'll go over them a little bit later that lets you do things at instant speed that red really doesn't have access to, that Purphoros does give you access to. The first category I'm talking about here is the value, and I don't think any card better represents what I'm talking about than Clone Shell, 5 mana, 2/2 artifact creature shapeshifter with imprint. It says when Clone Shell enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, then put the rest on the bottom, and then when it dies, you turn the exiled card face up, and if it's a creature, you put it onto the battlefield under your control. So with your commander at instant speed, you can pay 3 mana instead of 5, look at the top 4, get one of our, I think I have like 45 creatures or so in the deck, into exile, and then when it dies to our commander's trigger at the beginning of the next end step, we get that creature into play. So just crazy value with that guy there. Another great value creature, Triplicate Titan, 9 mana for a 9/9 artifact creature golem with flying, vigilance, and trample. It says when Triplicate Titan dies, you create a 3/3 colorless golem creature token with flying, 1 with vigilance, and 1 with trample. So for 3 mana, you're getting 3 3/3s with 3 different keywords. Also keep in mind that if you use your commander's ability on your turn, you can actually attack with these creatures because your commander gives your other creatures haste. So having a 9/9 flying, vigilance, trample, haste creature that dies and gives you 3 3/3s for only 3 mana is insane value. Just shows the potential of what can actually happen in this deck. Another really fun card here, Life of the Party, 3 and a red for a 0/1 elemental with first strike, trample, and haste. It says whenever Life of the Party attacks, it gets +X/+O until end of turn, where X is the number of creatures you control, and when Life of the Party enters the battlefield, if it's not a token, each opponent creates a token that's a copy of it, and they're goaded for the rest of the game. So this gives our opponent each a copy of Life of the Party that they have to hit each other with, that just exponentially get bigger as the game goes on and as their boards get bigger. Always wanted to find a home for this card because it just seems so much fun, and this is a perfect spot for it. And then we got some of those cards I was talking about earlier that are really tricky if you use them at instant speed, like Mindclaw Shaman, 4 and a red for a 2/2 Viashino Shaman. When Mindclaw Shaman enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals his or her hand, and then you may cast an instant or sorcery card from that player's hand without paying its mana cost. Just one scenario I thought of when playing a card like this: say opponent A casts a really big spell, opponent B has a counterspell in their hand, they tell you that they do, but they don't have the mana to cast it. You can actually instant speed with your commander's ability, put the Mindclaw Shaman into play, get the counterspell out of that opponent's hand, and cast it to counter that thing. That's just like one of the crazy things that you can do in a deck like this. A lot of these ETB creatures are obviously balanced around not having flash, so when you give them flash and a lower mana value most of the time with your commander's ability, you can get into some crazy scenarios. Kind of similarly to that one, we have Direfleet Daredevil, 1 and a red for a 2/1 human pirate with first strike. When Direfleet Daredevil enters the battlefield, exile target instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard, and then you may cast it this turn and spend mana of any color to cast it, and then you exile it after that. You know, there's multiple ways we can use this. Use it at instant speed to get like a removal spell or something like a counter spell out of an opponent's graveyard. Any instant sorcery you find in an opponent's graveyard that you might want to use, you could use it with Direfleet Daredevil. Next category I'm talking about here, the damage category up next. Some great uses of getting ETBs that deal damage to either opponents or opponents' creatures. Spawn of Thraxus, up first, 5 red for a 5/5 dragon with flying. It says when it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to target creature or player equal to the number of mountains you control. Being in a mono red deck, we're definitely going to have a fair amount of mountains, at least 5 for our commander, because that's where we're going to be cheating it out with, but we're going to likely have more than 5, so you're definitely going to want to wait till a little bit later in the game to use this Spawn of Thraxus. And since our creatures are going to be sacrificed to our commander's ability, I thought we might as well sacrifice them to something else instead beforehand. We have lots of ways to do so. Goblin Bombardment is one of those ways. 1 and a red for an enchantment, sacrifice a creature and have Goblin Bombardment deal 1 damage to any target. So just throwing around a little extra damage every time we use our commander's ability, and if those creatures would die, we can instead throw them at our opponents to deal more damage. We also have some fling effects in the deck like Bloodshot Cyclops, 5 and a red for a 4/4 giant. Tap, sacrifice a creature. It deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to target creature or players. So this is either removal for your opponent's creatures or just straight face damage. Either one works really well in this deck. Somewhat similarly to that one, Bloodfire Colossus, 6 red, so 8 mana for a 6/6 giant. Pay a red, sacrifice Bloodfire Colossus, and it deals 6 damage to each creature and each player. Unfortunately, this does hit you. However, your commander has indestructible, so it's not too bad. If all of your opponent's creatures are 6 or less toughness, I'd say this is definitely worth it. Or even if you get a majority of their stuff off the board, I'd say it's definitely worth it for 4 mana. Next up, going over some of the card draw. Knoll Spine Dragon up first. 5 red for a 7/5 dragon with flying. When Knoll Spine Dragon enters the battlefield, you may discard your hand and draw cards equal to the damage dealt to target opponent this turn. So you can do this on your turn when you've dealt a bunch of damage to your opponents. Play out as many cards from your hand as you can and then use this effect. Or you can actually save it for when an opponent is hitting another one of your opponents. Say they have a much bigger board than you. They do 20 damage to one of your opponents in combat. For 3 mana, put your Knoll Spine Dragon into play, discard your hand, then draw 20. Seems pretty good in a mono red deck, seeing as how we don't have a lot of draw in mono red. Ruin Grinder is another really good one. 5 and a red for a 7/4 artifact creature construct with menace. When Ruin Grinder dies, each player may discard their hand and draw 7 cards. So this is a wheel effect, but it also gives it to your opponents. However, it is not a must, it is a may. So if your opponents like their hands, they don't have to do this. I still think it's worth it for our end, even if it does help out our opponents a bit too. Sandstone Oracle is a really good one in this deck. 7 mana artifact creature Sphinx, 4/4 with flying. When Sandstone Oracle enters the battlefield, choose an opponent. If that player has more cards in hand than you, then you draw cards equal to the difference. So for 7 mana, this is definitely not worth it, but for 3 mana with our commander's ability, it is definitely worth it. You just wait until that blue player, you know, draws 10, 20 cards or whatever they usually do. Pay 3 mana for the Sandstone Oracle and then draw a ton of cards. That one's gonna be really fun to play. I threw in Skyline Despot into this category specifically because it gives you the Monarch, but 5 red for a 5/5 dragon with flying. When it ETBs, you become the Monarch, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you are the Monarch, create a 5/5 red dragon creature token with flying. One really interesting way to use Skyline Despot is to flash it in after the opponent to your right's end step has begun, but before the cleanup step. So that way you won't have to sacrifice the dragon until your end step. So you will get the upkeep trigger to get the 5/5 dragon with flying. Next up, some of the cool removal in this deck. Duplicant up first. 6 mana for a 2/4 artifact creature shapeshifter with imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-token creature, and then the duplicant basically steals the power and toughness and creature type of the card exiled with it, but it's still a shapeshifter. The important part is that 3 mana exile target non-token creature with your commander's ability. Another really cool one, Krenko's Buzz Crusher. 2 red for a 4/4 insect thopter with flying and trample. It says when Krenko's Buzz Crusher enters the battlefield, for each player destroy up to 1 non-basic land that player controls. For each land destroyed this way, its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. If there's one thing red is really good at, it is getting rid of lands. Now, I wouldn't say go out and destroy all your opponent's lands, but having targeted removal for really important lands for your opponents is definitely a must. And I think every commander deck, Ghost Quarter, you know, is a really popular land for that reason. But being able to destroy 1 for each opponent is really handy. Similarly to the duplicant, we got Meteor Golem. 7 mana for a 3/3 artifact creature golem. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent and opponent control. So basically, you're using it the same way you are the duplicant. Pay 3 mana at instant speed and destroy target non-land permanent. This one luckily hits any permanent as opposed to the duplicant that just hits creatures. However, it does exile creatures, so both are good in their own respects. Ryusei the Falling Star up next. 5 and a red for a 5/5 dragon spirit with flying. When Ryusei dies, it deals 5 damage to each creature without flying, so this is like a mini board wipe. So obviously you're going to wait until the value is best for you, but 3 mana for this effect is definitely a good rate. We also have Zealous Conscripts in the deck. 4 and a red for a 3/3 human warrior with haste. When it ETBs, gain control of target permanent until end of turn, and then untap that permanent and gains haste until end of turn. So there's a couple ways you can use this. If your opponent's about to attack you with some giant creature, you can obviously take that. Or if one of your opponents is about to, you know, go off with a non-creature permanent or something like that, you can also steal it because it doesn't say just creatures, it just says permanents. But if it happens to be a creature, there's a lot of ways like the Goblin Bombardment that we can sacrifice the stolen creatures to. That way your opponents don't get them back. And then for the ramp category, just a couple of cards to talk about here. One of the best cards in the deck, Elena Kessig Trapper. 4 and a red for a 4/3 human scout with first strike. It says tap, add an amount of red equal to the greatest power among creatures you control that enter the battlefield this turn. So whenever you're flashing in your Knoll Spine Dragon or whatever it is, giant 7 power creature, tap your Elena to add 7 red. Then you can use your commander's ability 2 more times. It's going to be insane value with Elena. Another good ramp piece, Thermopod. 4 and a red for a 4/3 snow creature slug. The important text is you can sacrifice a creature to add red to your mana pool. So similarly to the Goblin Bombardment, if we are going to be sacrificing those creatures anyway, we might as well be getting value out of them, and adding red to your mana pool is a good way to do so. Then you can, you know, activate your commander's ability again or cast other spells, whatever you want to do. And the last category I'm talking about here is the utility category. Just some really good cards that don't really fit into the other categories categories but help propel our deck forward. First up, I got Battle Mage's Bracers, 2 and a red for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature has haste, and then whenever an ability of equipped creature is activated, if it isn't a mana ability, you may pay 1 and then you copy it. Equip 2. So this lets us cheat in 2 creatures for 4 mana as opposed to 2 creatures for 6 mana. Just a little bit of a discount on our commander's ability. Another great way to reduce our commander's ability is with Heartstone, 3 mana artifact. It says activated abilities of creatures cost 1 less to activate, but it can't reduce it to less than 1. So this does work for your opponents too, but I think we're definitely going to be taking a lot more advantage of it. In the same vein, Thran Turbine, 1 mana artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may add up to 2 colorless mana to your mana pool, but it can't be spent on spells, so you have to use it for activated abilities. During our upkeep, we can use our commander's ability just for a single red. And I also threw in a backup of our commander's ability, obviously with Sneak Attack, 3 and a red for an enchantment. Pay a red, and you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, and that creature gains haste, sack at the beginning of the next end step. So it's the exact same ability pretty much as our commander's ability. It does cost less, so if you have this out, you're probably going to want to use that as opposed to your commanders. It's just nice that we have redundancy in the deck for an effect like this. And then after our creatures have been sacrificed with our commander, there are some ways we can reuse them with cards like Dollhouse of Horrors, 5 mana artifact, pay 1 and tap it, exile a creature card from your graveyard, then you create a token that's a copy of the exile card, except it's a 0/0 construct in addition to its other types, and it has this creature gets +1/+1 for each construct you control. It gains haste till end turn, activate as a sorcery, so you can't do this at instant speed, but paying 1 mana to get all these giant creatures back out of our graveyard that have ETBs, that's the important part. We don't really care about the power and toughness. That is somewhat an aspect, but the ETBs/dies triggers are the important parts of our deck. Similarly to that one, Felden of the Third Path, 1 red for a 2/3 human artificer, pay 2 and red, tap it, create a token that's a copy of target creature card in your graveyard, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types, and then it gains haste, sack it at the beginning of the next end step. So kind of similar to our commander, just lets us buy those ETBs from our creatures, but this one lets us do it out of our graveyard. And then getting some additional value from when we use our commander's ability, Flame Shadow Conjuring, 3 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay red, and if you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature. It gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step. So paying 4 mana essentially for our commander's ability to get 2 versions of whatever creature we're cheating in is definitely worth it. And then possibly the best card in our deck, Sundial of the Infinite, 2 mana artifact, pay 1, tap it, end the turn, and then activate this ability only during your turn. So what this does is we can cheat a bunch of creatures into play with either Sneak Attack, our Purphoros, our Felden, anything like that, and then end the turn with our Sundial of the Infinite when we go to our end step. So when the trigger for our commander says, oh, we're going to sacrifice all these creatures, you can say, instead, I'm going to end the turn. All of those triggers will empty off the stack, and then we'll be able to permanently keep those creatures into play. This card is definitely a little more expensive than the usual cards that I suggest on my channel, but since it's absolutely the best card in our deck, it is essential that I talk about it. Even if you don't want to include it in your list, it is definitely worth considering if you want to upgrade this deck a little bit later. And last but not least, probably my favorite interaction in the entire deck with World Gorger Dragon, 3 red for a 7/7 Nightmare Dragon with flying and trample. It says when World Gorger Dragon enters the battlefield, you exile all other permanents you control, and then when World Gorger Dragon leaves the battlefield, you bring all of those exiled cards back. I love all the interactions you can use with this card. The coolest one probably is an opponent casts a board wipe, being a farewell or whatever it is, whatever's going to blow up your whole board, even if it's like an Armageddon or something like that. You World Gorger Dragon in response with your commander's ability for just 3 mana, all of your permanents exile, and then when the board wipe or whatever goes off, the World Gorger Dragon will die, you'll get all your stuff back, and then that'll pretty much put you in the lead, because if it's Armageddon, you're definitely winning that game, and if it's just a board wipe or creature board wipe or whatever it is, you're still going to be in the lead because you have all your permanents. So that's it for my Purphoros Bronze-Blooded ETB value deck. I really like this commander. I like the different strategies that you get to use, because being able to cheat out giant creatures that have cool effects, you don't really get to see a lot of these creatures very often. That comes with a couple of different benefits. One being a lot of these cards are really cheap, you know, 20-30 cents for one of these giant creatures that like nobody's playing because they're just not very efficiently costed. Being able to use them with your commander's ability for way cheaper just makes it way more valuable. This is one I'm definitely looking at putting together in paper. And the cool thing about this one is they're coming out with cool ETB creatures all the time. It's a pretty mainstay effect in Magic. So this is one that you could constantly be updating, changing. If you don't like a certain thing, if it's too powerful, if it's not powerful enough, there's a lot of different aspects to the deck that you can change. I have the full deck list down in the description if you want to check it out. Also in the description, I have a link to my Patreon if anybody feels like supporting the channel. I have a little intro video over there if you want to go give it a watch. But that's pretty much all I've got for today. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. All right, take care.